Over the past 200 years, the Western world has seen some of the most successful achievements. No one can have missed the great contributions the West has made to lift the living standards of people around the world. Yet, in this new millennium, things seem to have been changing. Kishore Mahbubani, Singapore's distinguished former ambassador to the United Nations, argues in his new book that owing to some strategic mistakes the West has made, a cycle of Western domination of the world is coming to a natural end. The rest, as he terms the non-West, is on the rise. China and India stand particularly prominent in his narrative. So has the West lost it or not? Is a new world order rising? Should China and India worry about losing it like the West? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. Joining me in the studio is Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a professor at the National University of Singapore and Chun Chiu Senior Fellow at the China Institute in Fudan University. Professor Mahbubani, thank you very much for joining us in the studio. Pleasure. First of all, your new book is titled, Has the West Lost It? A Provocation. What do you mean by Has the West Lost It?
Well, it's actually, my book is actually a gift to the West, because I'm going to wake up the West to a new reality that is 200-year period of Western domination of world history since 1820 was a major historical aberration. Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. And so it was perfectly natural that the aberration would end, perfectly natural that China and India would return. Unfortunately, the West doesn't understand that this is happening. So my book is intended as a wake-up call to the West, saying, wake up, it's a new world coming, and if you don't wake up, you will lose it.
Well, what do you mean by the West? Do you mean the Western mind, the Western world, the Western government, the Western people, the Western ideology? What exactly are you pointing to here?
I would say we often underestimate how cohesively the West works as a political and economic bloc. And of course, this is when I speak about the West, I mean primarily North America, United States and Canada, and of course the European Union, and you can add in Australia and New Zealand if you want to also. But this bloc has been very cohesive, as you know, during the Cold War, and developed a very strong kind of political and economic unity that carried on after the Cold War ended. And if you want to understand why Russia is such an angry country today, is because the West, Europe and America combined, unwisely expanded NATO into the former spaces of the Soviet Union, going against the explicit assurances that were given to Gorbachev by the Father Bush administration and by the European leaders. And that's an example of how the West acts cohesively and unwisely since the end of the Cold War.
Why are you calling it a provocation if it is a gift?
Well, I think that, to be honest with you, that was the choice of my publisher, Penguin, and he said, okay, it might help the book sell. But it is both, how do you say, provocative, in the sense that it's intended to wake up the West, get it out of its comfort zones, and with the goal of helping the West adjust and adapt to a different world.
Well, I think a lot of people would disagree with you on many of these things. But first of all, what you just said about India and China having always been the more dominant or more powerful countries, what gives you the confidence that this is going to happen? Is it simply because we are more numerous?
By the way, it's not going to happen. It has happened. Today already, in purchasing power parity terms. Let me give you one example. In 1980, the United States share of the global GNP in PPP terms was 25%, and China's share was 2.2%, less than 1/10 of the United States. But in 2014, 4 years ago, the China's share became bigger than the United States. So we have already seen it happen already in PPP terms, and we will see it happening in nominal terms too. So today, if you look at the 4 largest economies in the world in PPP terms, Number 1 is China, number 2 is United States, number 3 is India, number 4 is Japan. So 3 out of the 4 largest economies in the world are already Asian. Now, 100 years ago, that wasn't true. See how much we have changed.
But if you talk, you are talking about this PPP terms. People still are not very familiar. Some people would not agree. They would still think that China is the number 2 economy and it's going to take decades. Some say 10 years, some say 20, 30 years. Until China catches up with the United States, and also when you talk about per capita terms, right, there's still a big gap there. How do you look at that?
Well, you know, the most important thing when you look at these things is not where we are as a static moment in time, is the trends. Where will we be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And even PricewaterhouseCoopers has predicted that by 2050, look, if you don't want to accept PPP terms, let's take nominal terms. By 2050, in nominal terms, China will be number 1, India will be number 2, United States will be number 3. So even in nominal terms, big changes are happening. So the reality is that the reason why the West leapt ahead and went so far ahead was because it mastered many things like science and technology, the use of reason, good governance, all these things they used to explode ahead of the world. Now the West actually has very generously shared all these gifts with the rest of the world. So whatever the West could do well yesterday, the rest can do well today, and often better. And if you look, for example, to give you a shocking statistic, okay? The most competitive places to enter in the world are the world's top universities in America. And that's a sure sign of what you call brain power advantage.
Right.
And where there's a completely level playing field, right? And where there's no racial barriers at all, like the Caltech, California Institute of Technology. You know, the Asians make up a relatively small percentage of applicants to these universities, but 43% of Caltech is Asian or Asians or Asian American. Now that's a sign that there are tremendous pools of brain power in Asia that were not exploited for centuries and that are now being harvested. So if the West doesn't understand that this is going to change the world fundamentally, they are still sleeping. And my book is saying, wake up. You've been sleeping.
Yeah, I think one of the people that definitely don't want to wake up or don't see things in the same way as you do is U.S. President Donald Trump. He had this to say during the press conference he gave right after his historic summit with the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. Let's take a listen.
Well, my expectation about China is that China is a great country with a great leader and a friend of mine. And I really believe that he's happy that we've made this kind of progress. And I've heard from him. But I will be calling him very shortly, maybe even before I land. Okay? And I have to say, you know, and the United States is a great country. And we have set records economically, over $7 trillion in net worth addition to what we have. And we are almost twice the size of the economy of the United States. Nobody talks about this because you do hear a lot about China, rightfully so. But the United States now is almost twice the size of the economy of China. We have a great country and we're on a correct path.
So a couple of things here. First of all, he said the United States is twice the size in terms of economy of China. That's very different from what we have been talking about.
Well, let me tell you, number one, he's factually incorrect. The U.S. economy is 1.6 times the size of China, not twice. But more importantly, in the year 2000, which is only 18 years ago, the United States GNP in nominal terms was 8 times the size of China. How did it go from 8 times to 1.6 times? Come on, that's an indication of how significant the shift has been between the United States and China. And there is in American minds, and President Donald Trump reflects that to some extent, the Americans assume that they will be number one forever. Now, how can 350 million people who make up 5% of the world's population continue to have a GNP which is 25%, which they used to have? It can't happen anymore. It could only happen when the rest of the world was underperforming. Now the rest of the world has stopped underperforming. So Americans must get used to a new world where America will become number 2.
Well, President Trump is saying America has to be number 1, America first. So in a way, he has to do the right thing, right? The second thing that struck me when I heard this, I wondered why he needed to mention this to the world. Why he needed to remind to the world, to his audience, that America is still much bigger than China. It's almost like he's feeling, you know, hey, China is doing great, but don't forget, we are the number 1. Do you have the same impression?
Well, you see, before I'm now, as you know, the Chinchu Fellow at Fudan University now. So before becoming as a Chinchu Fellow in Fudan University, I spent 6 weeks in Columbia University and 5 weeks in Harvard University this year. And I got a very good feel of the sentiment in America. And I think Americans are feeling lost. They know intuitively, they can feel it, that the amount of power and control that they had over the world, which was an exceptional moment, especially between the end of the Cold War, 1990, and maybe after the great financial crisis, global financial crisis, 2008-2009, power was incredible. And America could act unilaterally and do whatever it wanted to do. Now it's losing it. And the tragedy for America is that at a time when the United States should switch from being unilateral to becoming more multilateral, they have sadly elected the most unilateral president that America has ever had, President Donald Trump. But I'm glad he also said, I'm a good friend of President Xi Jinping. I'm a good friend of China. Because at the end of the day, America has to work with China.
We're going to take a very short break. My guest has been Kishore Mahbubani, and we'll be right back to talk about the implications of if the West has lost it. Welcome back. Professor Mahbubani, you mentioned the West made at least 2 strategic mistakes, right? First of all, at the end of the Cold War around 1990, you said the West had a great hubris and triumphalism, and the second was about 2001 when the 911 happened, but also when China joined the World Trade Organization. Why do you think the West ignored the important significance of China joining the global markets?
Well, I think I'm glad you mentioned the 2 strategic mistakes, and I think they're both equally important. Because at the end of the Cold War, the West didn't notice that at a time of great triumphalism, when they believe in Francis Fukuyama's essay that we've reached the end of history and we can now carry on autopilot, Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because he put the West to sleep at exactly the time when China and India were waking up. That was the first strategic mistake. But the second strategic mistake happened in 2001, because in 2001, when you ask anyone in the West what happened, they said, oh, of course, 9/11 happened. I was in Manhattan when 9/11 happened, so I could feel the political shock that 9/11 had, the attack on the World Trade Center towers had on America. But what America didn't notice, and what in fact even Europe didn't notice, is that the more significant event in 2001 was China's entry into WTO. Because clearly, if you follow Western economic theory, if you suddenly inject 800 million new workers into the global capitalist system, obviously there will be creative destruction, as Joseph Schumpeter said would happen, and obviously jobs will be lost in Europe and in America. This is all a result of just pure competition. And because the American elites didn't pay attention to it, lots of Americans lost their jobs, the American working class got very angry, and that's how Donald Trump was elected in 2016. It was a result of the working class anger at not seeing their lives improve.
But I would say, while China joined the World Trade Organization, bringing disruption to the global markets, including to the job markets in other countries, didn't the rest of the world also benefited from this huge increase of trade with China? Because trade is never a one-sided affair, only China selling, so China is winning all the time. Didn't the China joining the WTO also brought concrete benefits to the other countries?
China's admission to WTO and China's provision of so many low-cost commodities made a significant improvement in the living standards of the working classes in America. Now, one shocking statistic about the American workers is that the median income of the American worker hasn't gone up in 40 years. But what enabled them to have a relatively good life? It was products from China. And if you go to Walmart in America, all the products that the Americans used to pay so much for a television set, now they pay so little for a television set. So all this has actually benefited the American working classes.
If you put the pros and cons together, was it a good thing that China joined?
It was an absolutely good thing that China joined the WTO. And
from the perspective of the West, of the Western public?
Yes, it was a good thing, but the West, of course, had to adjust and adapt. See, even Singapore had to adjust and adapt. There's some industries we could no longer compete in. We said, okay, we give up those industries, we move to other industries. But the Americans, as I said, were sleeping on the job. The American leaders, the American elites, and they didn't pay attention to their working classes. So the great failure in America is not the failure of the working classes, it's the failure of the elites who didn't explain to their working classes that we have to change and adapt in this new world.
The reason why I ask those questions is because actually some people in the United States, even within the U.S. administration, are saying it was a mistake to allow China to join the World Trade Organization. Do you think there should have been another way for China from the perspective of the West, not letting China joining the World Trade Organization? Would the West decline be postponed, be reversed?
The end of Western domination of world history was inevitable. It was going to happen. Whether China joined the WTO or not joined the WTO, China would have continued to transform itself. When China opened up to the world and imported and accepted the best practices of the world, China was going to become, in any case, a competitive global economy inside the WTO or outside the WTO. It was going to happen anyway. And in fact, it's better for it to happen inside the WTO, because the WTO creates a rules-based order which is a level playing field for everyone. And it's a great mistake for the Trump administration to walk away from the World Trade Organization, because if you do have complaints about let's say if you believe that China is doing something wrong, bring it to the WTO. And China has accepted the judgments of the WTO whenever they're passed, whether they're favorable or unfavorable to China. And that's the best way to transform things.
But President Trump doesn't seem to believe in that system. He's making trouble for the approval of the judges on the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, meaning I don't really judge those supranational arbitration. I want to do things the way I want to do it. Can the United States do that?
Let me quickly add here that it's important to acknowledge that President Donald Trump is having problems not just with China on trade issues, he's also having problems with his best friend Canada, and also with the Europeans. So it's not against China alone. I think President Donald Trump and his advisors genuinely misunderstand the trade issue. The trade deficit, bilateral trade deficits are never the problem. You have to look at the overall trade balance. And the United States has trade deficits with some countries and trade surpluses with other countries.
Or in service versus goods.
Yeah, and it also has an overall trade deficit. But the overall trade deficit is a result of the fact that America has what somebody has called an exorbitant privilege. Now, when China exports products to America, Chinese workers have to work very hard all day to manufacture the product. But when America wants to pay for it, it can print money and pay for the product.
Mm-hmm.
Now, no other country in the world can print money and use it as a global currency in the way that the United States has. So the United States actually is enjoying a special privilege, and my fear is that Americans are not aware that they're endangering that exorbitant privilege by starting these trade wars.
You said the West needs to wake up, needs to see the reality and adapt to it. But the paradox is, some people might say, if they wake up and start to see the reality and embrace the reality, wouldn't they be hasten their own decline in history?
Well, I think their relative decline cannot be stopped. I mean, it's so abnormal for 12% of the world's population, for example, to have 50% of the vote in the International Monetary Fund, IMF. That reflects an old reality. So they have to learn to give up their power, and it's in their interest to learn to give up power, because by not giving up power, the West is continuing to interfere in the internal affairs of many countries overseas. The West is continuing to bomb Muslim countries, and one shocking statistic I heard is that in the last year of his administration, and President Obama, Barack Obama, is a peaceful man. He's not a warlike figure. He was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. But in his last year of his administration, he dropped something like 26,000 bombs in 7 countries. Why is America bombing so many countries? Why are the Western countries continue to bomb other countries? They should stop. It's not in their interest to do so. It's now in their interest to change their behavior and go from being unilateral to multilateral, and use the United Nations as the vehicle to create a better world order, which will make it a more peaceful world for the West and a more peaceful world for the rest.
Where do you see the strategic future of the European countries and what they need to look at now?
Well, I think it's not a big secret that Europe is very lost. And I think one of the key recommendations that I make in my book, Has the West Lost It?, is that when you want to handle geopolitics, the critical word in geopolitics is geo, G-E-O, which stands for geography. Now, the geography of North America, which is separated by the Atlantic Ocean, is different from the geography of Europe. In the case of Europe, the long-term challenges that it faces are not the long-term challenges that the United States faces. So the Europeans should understand their geography. And I can tell you what the long-term strategic challenge for Europe is, because, you know, it's coming from Africa. And in 1950, to give you one amazing statistic, in 1950, Europe's population was twice that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is more than twice of Europe. But by 2100, Africa's population will be 10 times the size of Europe. That's where your challenge is. So, this is where Europe should be working with China to develop Africa. That's where European interests lie. But Europeans cannot work with China in Africa because America says, stop, don't help China in Africa.
If the West has lost it, what about the rest? You were saying China, India, and the rest of the world will rise as they had been for the past 1,800 years before the West rose. Is it a sure thing? Will these two countries have a possible different trajectory?
You know, if you want to understand the potential of India, everyone has seen the potential of China already. We know how well China has done. If you want to understand the potential of India, ask yourself, why is it that in the most competitive human laboratory in the world, which is the United States of America, the United States brings in the top brains from the whole world to come and live and work in the United States? And guess which ethnic group has the highest household income?
Indian.
In Indians, in America. Look at some of the biggest companies in America. Look at Microsoft. Look at PepsiCo. They're run by Indians. Look at Silicon Valley, Indian venture capital. Look at the top business schools in America. Harvard Business School. Who's the dean? An Indian. So you get a sense. So it's a very simple thing. The brains of the rest of the world, especially the brains of Chinese and Indians, are not inferior to the brains in the West.
The two people have yet to understand each other well enough from the kind of exchange we witnessed since last year till now, especially when we had these border frictions. What advice would you give to the Chinese people as to how to better understand the Indian people so that we can in the future interact with Indians better? And what advice you would give to the Indians about how to better understand with the Chinese?
I would say my one big advice to China is that please remember that China's economy is 5 times the size of India's economy. The population is about the same size, but China's population is 5 times the size of India's population. People normally expect the bigger country, the more powerful country, the more wealthy country to be more generous. And I think China can afford to be more generous in its relationship with India.
Generous in what?
No, I think in terms of economic relationships, you know, China was very, very generous to the ASEAN countries. And when it signed a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, it made unilateral trade concessions that helped the ASEAN countries a lot. China could do this because China is much bigger than the ASEAN countries. And today, China's GNP is 5 times the size of India. So China can also afford to be generous on the economic front in dealing with India. But on the part of the Indians, if I had to give advice to India, I would say the biggest strategic mistake that India could make is to align itself with any Western policy or American policy that tries to contain China. And my goal this year is to write a book on US-China relations, to try and advise the United States of America, don't even try a containment policy on China because it's not going to work. But as you know, the United States is trying to build up some kind of coalition, and one of them is called Quads. And Quads is United States, Japan, Australia, and India. So things like this, I'm sure, create a lot of discomfort for China. And India can play a more positive, constructive role as an independent actor and not seen to be aligned with either China or with the West in a relationship between the two.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is now professor with the National University of Singapore. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this special edition.